Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Anton. I'm the director at the Arlington Art Center, and we're so excited about today's artist talk with Annabel Daou. One quick housekeeping thing, there will be a Q&A portion toward the end of the conversation, and so if you could use the Q&A function at the bottom, and then Blair will facilitate those questions for you. But first, let me introduce Blair Murphy, our curator of exhibitions at AAC. Many of you know her and her phenomenal work she's done here, and so she's going to lead this conversation. Blair?
Yes, thank you so much, Katie, and thanks to Annabel for being with us today. It's been really great to work with her and be able to show her work at AAC. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to do a couple quick housekeeping kind of things. Like Katie mentioned, we'll take questions towards the end of the talk, so you can put those in the Q&A. Annabel's work is on view right now at Arlington Art Center, which is in Arlington, Virginia. We're right outside of DC. If you're not familiar with us, we have an exhibitions program, an education program, and a residency program. So we're in a building right off the Virginia Square Metro, so we're very easy to get to. Annabel's work is up through this Saturday, March 26th is the final day. So if you haven't had a chance to come out to see the show yet, I would really encourage you to do that in the next few days. We have a couple other exhibitions on view right now as well. In Spite of Modernism, which is an group exhibition curated by Haley Klauser, a guest curator, is up through Saturday as well. And then an exhibition by one of our resident artists, Snake Arakami. So we've got a lot going on in the building. We really encourage you to come out and see the exhibitions in person if you can. So thanks again to Annabel. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to show a couple short clips of the work that's in the exhibition. And then she and I will sort of have a conversation about those. But to start, Annabel's work has been shown at the National Museum of Beirut, the Park Avenue Armory, New York, KW Berlin, the Drawing Room, London, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Dublin. It's in public collections in the US and abroad, including the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Middle Collection, Houston, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and the Yale University Art Gallery, New Haven. Daou was a Pollock Krasner resident at the International Studio and Curatorial Program in New York in 2019 and 2020. She was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and lives in New York right now. Her sound piece, Declaration, is currently on view at the Ulrich Museum of Art in Wichita, Kansas, and it was acquired for the Ulrich's Permanent Collection in 2021. And she also has an exhibition coming up in Dallas, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about at the end of the conversation. So to start, like I mentioned, we are going to show just a short couple clips of the videos. So we'll start off with one of the works that is on view at AAC right now, A Year Like Any Other. So I'm going to pull that up really quickly. Both of the pieces are fairly long, so we'll just be showing a couple minutes of each. And everyone should be able to see this.
January 1, a million protesters take to the streets. January 2, a man who was making art dies. January 3, a drone strike kills a general. January 4, an invitation to an exhibition is received. January 5, a man recalls a photograph he took of a young woman once. January 6, a prolific serial rapist is sentenced to life in prison. January 7, a stampede takes place at a general's funeral. January 8, a plane is shot down shortly after takeoff. January 9, a rare circumbinary planet is discovered. January 10, a group of friends attend an art opening. January 11, a 100-year-old tortoise retires to the wild. January 12, a volcano erupts and thousands are evacuated. January 13, a man dies in prison after a hunger strike. January 14, a contribution of $2.70 is made to a political campaign. January 15, a mutiny is quelled by armed forces. January 16, a trial to impeach a politician begins. January 17, an artist meets a friend for coffee at a former dance club. January 18, a drone strike kills 80 military personnel. January 19, a blizzard causes several deaths from hypothermia. January 20, a country honors a man who was assassinated. January 21, a country announces its first case of a virus. January 22, a report says that a massive fire has killed 1 billion animals. January 23, a city is sealed off to prevent the spread of a virus. January 24, a citywide protest calls for the withdrawal of an occupying army's troops. January 25, a photograph is taken of a rainbow arching over a building. January 26, an athlete dies in a helicopter crash. January 27, an infected man is placed in an isolation ward. January 28, a peace plan is signed by 2 corrupt politicians. January 29, an officer is charged with murder for shooting a man whose hands were cuffed. January 30, a public health emergency of international concern is declared. January 31, a kingdom and an island formally withdraw from a union.
I thought that was a good place to sort of stop for now. You can imagine the work continues if you haven't had a chance to see it through the year. And I think when I first saw this piece, which was included in a virtual exhibition held by Signs and Symbols in New York, which is how I first experienced it, I was really struck by a sense of recognition, but also alienation. It really sort of reflected or gave me a sense of deja vu about how time had felt, or sort of the attempt to sort of experience time during 2020 had felt, and the ambivalence of that, and sort of how we tried to make sense of the passage of time when things felt so disrupted, and then also there being a sense of kind of wanting the days to add up to some greater understanding of what was going on, but then that being sort of elusive. So I guess my sort of initial question, Annabel, you can sort of generally talk about the work as well, but was how you went about selecting the events for each day and kind of what that process was like.
Yeah, first of all, hello everyone, and Blair, thank you so much for this. It's really interesting for me to have these 2 works up at the same time. It's got me thinking about a lot of different things, but one of them, I mean, it feeds into your question, was I think right before, I grew up in Lebanon during the war, and I was very conscious of the fact that there are constantly things happening, big things happening, but how does that affect people on the ground? How does that actually affect our individual lives? And so when people began to talk about, because I actually did January retrospectively. I started the project really kind of in February, towards the end of February. So, and then from then on, I was clocking every single day by finding an event. So the way that I really kind of thought about it was people were beginning to talk about, about the virus and about how things were different than ever before, and the kind of a year like no other, And I was thinking about, well, that feels that way, but for a lot of people in a lot of different places, there's always a kind of drama. There are difficult things happening all the time. And so I started scanning the news every day and looking at what people chose as headlines. And then so you'd look at a headline that would say something about something that happened in the US, and then you see that a bus with 80 people had gone off a cliff somewhere. Almost every day a bus goes off a cliff somewhere in the world. And I was thinking about what's important, what's important and to whom. So that was kind of how it came about, and also about the ordinariness of, there isn't ever going to be a moment in the world or in our lives where everything is fine, even though that's the way we kind of act, as though there will be a moment where this won't be happening. But if you look at the world and consider it as a whole place, there's something always happening to somebody that matters to them. And, so.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning too, for anyone who's watching who hasn't seen the video, I think in some ways January is not the most representative because it probably has the most references to the pandemic. That might or might not be exactly right, but in general, I think it's the most sort of recognizable, like, oh, right, I remember that moment. If you're someone, I was in the gallery with someone last week and we happened to walk in October or something, and they actually made the comment like, oh, does she never mention it? And I was like, oh no, you sort of get it, you know, it comes up earlier on. But to get what you're saying about that's sort of all these things are happening, but you're always sort of living your life. And I think that's, there are also the days where you select something, you've included something that's more sort of everyday. You know, someone receiving an artist receives an invitation to an opening, or things like that, that kind of are just sort of, you know, from someone's day-to-day life, kind of private moments from someone's day-to-day life, which I think sort of gets to that point you're saying about those things are always happening as well.
Yeah, and you know, I chose to begin every single sentence with the word a, you know, in order to kind of create a sense of both the personal and the individual and the bigger picture of anyone. You know, if someone were to find this, you know, thinking about looking back at this at some point as an object that almost like, you know, remains, does it really matter who experienced that in that sense, you know, in a retrospective sense? But I also, you know, and I think a lot of us felt this way about that year, and maybe even continue to. It might be one of the bigger changes, is the sense of a kind of ping-ponging between how things affect us individually and how things affect us in a kind of global way. Because I think for the first time, we're able to see our connections constantly, you know. And I think I was trying I was also trying to say that the things, the bigger things that happen actually happen to us in a small way, you know. And I'm really interested in the very small things that, you know, matter. There was a day that I was in the park and I was, you know, just sitting on the grass, and of course everything was happening at that point around me, but really I was sitting on the grass, you know, for me. So that was, I was trying to really relay that feeling of going between all of us and one of us, you know.
Yeah, that tension sort of between like individual experience versus collective experience, which I think is one of the things that connects the work to some of your other projects as well. I think that's something you've been interested in. Your interest in that is reflected in some of your work I've kind of seen in addition to this piece. Can you talk a little bit about what about that tension kind of interests you, or other ways you've explored it?
Yeah, I mean, my first encounter, my first attachment to art was like Egyptian wall drawings. And one of the things that I found really kind of interesting about the residue, about things like that, is that you don't really know who made anything. I mean, that's not what you're looking at it for. You're kind of looking at the residue of people being together, people being somewhere together. And for me, I kind of want to bring that feeling into the process of my making. So like, I feel like my work is in some sense a residue of being there, not always with another person, but with the consciousness that there are other people. So even when I'm in my room alone, I feel like I'm making, you know, that response to the previous question. It's both I'm there, but I'm also there with other people. And you know, that's kind of where I think my work comes into being. It's the question of, you know, I use a lot of language, but language always considers that someone will be reading it, or someone will be hearing you read it. And that dynamic of the two or more, for me, that's what I feel like my process of making art is about. It's about kind of giving voice, that's not a good word, giving is not what I mean, but just like accumulating our voices, you know, at a given moment. And in that sense, I think there's a social political element to my work, if there is any. It's about that, you know, it's about having our voices heard together.
I was going to show a clip as well of Chow Hayden, the other work in the show, but do you want to do maybe an introduction to the piece in advance so people have a sense of it before.
Yeah. So I grew up in Lebanon, lived there during the war, and I came to America when I was 18. And I kept going back, but I never went back and did any like art projects there, or very little. And then I was invited to by Amanda Abi Khalil, who runs a public art platform in Lebanon, does public art projects, and they invited me to make a work in the National Museum. But the National Museum didn't allow. It's a museum of archaeological objects, and they didn't allow anything in the museum. You couldn't have any contemporary art. You couldn't even have a piece of paper because it's through the Directorate of Antiquities, you know, and there's a lot of red tape and stuff. So we thought, well, it would be interesting to put voices in there, you know, because sound would kind of get around that. So I invited people, like literally went down in the street, we put posters, we went to NGOs and brought people into the museum who didn't even know what a museum was, because in Lebanon, there isn't a museum culture at all. There's, you know, this big old museum, and the archaeological objects that are in the museum are also in the street, you know. I told you we had a sarcophagus in front of our building when my mom planted geraniums. So, and that was very normal for people. So I also wanted to bring in people who didn't really think about museum culture and didn't really have language around that. And another part of it is that the idea was to bring people in, have them walk around the museum with me in an almost performative way. I had questions that were really kind of scripted, and we would walk around and they would respond. And we ended up having about 150 people from all walks of life. And part of the whole process was that element of walking through there. Mm-hmm. Then I recorded their voices and we turned it into an audio guide that they allowed us to have in the museum. So if one could go to the museum now, you can walk through the museum with this audio guide. It's both a work of art and a kind of guide through the objects. Not all of them, but many of them. And then the other element I was going to say is, you know, Lebanon, the English and French are really used for art. They're used in those contexts. They're used in educated circles. Many people don't even speak Arabic all that well, actually, if they're really educated. But then there are a lot of people who only speak Arabic. So I decided to do it in Arabic, which was kind of hard for me too, because I hadn't been, you know, and trying to find a language around art in Arabic is pretty difficult. But it ended up, so the whole audio guide is in Arabic. The second phase of that afterwards was I then did a show in Berlin at my gallery, and I decided it would be interesting to take some of my images that I took with my iPhone, the way a person walks through a museum and takes images, and create a video with it. So that's what we're looking at now. I hope that answered. Did I say?
Yeah, that's great. I just realized that while we were talking, it was good to sort of give people a general sense of the work and the story behind it before we jumped in. So I'm gonna we'll show a couple clips of Chow Hayden now.
أنا في علي كتير بصمات إيدين
كتير
بشكل إنه ما حتى بينعرضوا.
كتير ناس. كم واحد؟ كتير ناس عقد الزياح اللي فيه أكتر من الألوان. هو الألوان الدم اللي قتلت
ما قتلت حدا. لا ما قتلت حدا، بس ما بدي قتلت حدا لأنه كان لازم.
لا بفضل كونوا ورا الإزاز وما عادش يكون في دم على إيدي.
ايه وقوتي ما راحت بعد. لا
ايه بس يصيروا الوقت بدي اكسر الازاز وكمل حياتي.
لا بعدني عندي
بفضل اكون بالعالم، بس بحب احلم، ففيني احلم من هون.
صدى كتير مي وكتير اشياء تانية خلوني صدي. فيك تعطيني للحام يلي بفن الشباك عنده سكاكين كتير بشعة؟
لا ما بيهم اذا بتعرفي قصتي او لا، لانه المهم هو المستقبل وشو فيك تعملي فيه.
إذا إذا في ستاتيو مثل هولي وعندها إيد مكسرة فينا نلزقها.
فيك تحط الخواتم تبعونك
أنا
عليها.
بقول فينا
بأوضة النوم.
في نكتب معها عليها نمسك شيء.
أنا بصراحة بعلقه
في حط إيد عليها.
بزين فيها بيتي.
في اسفق كافية.
يعني فيك انها هيك مسلمة فيك تسلم عليها هيك.
في حتى على ورق لحتى ما يطيروا الورق.
تحطه عندك بالبيت.
كمان بدنا نحط عندك بالبيت.
كأنه ايد حدا قطع ايده بده يسلمها لحدا.
هيدي ايد مفتوحة.
هيدي الايد
بدك تعمل تاكل.
فيني امسكها وبوسها
مثل كأنه حدا غرقان وعم بعلق ايده حدا يساعده.
شو بدي اعمل بالايد؟ بسلم عليها.
حط كفي عليها.
اكسرها شوف شو فيها جوا.
So that's general structure sort of continues for the rest of the video with the questions and then this the recordings of the answers. And like you mentioned, this, you were sort of actively bringing people into the museum to participate, and that sort of participatory element, and also I think when I first saw the work, someone who works for an arts organization, I was sort of interested in that power dynamic of between the museum and the public, and kind of flipping that on its head a little bit, or inviting the people to engage with these objects in a totally different way. How did that play out with the project? Were there sort of things that surprised you?
Yeah, so I the first and it's good because it showed both. In the first one, I said to them, "You're the knife," that was all I said. "You're the knife. Did you kill anyone?" And that those were the answers. We got a lot more answers. I worked with a really wonderful sound artist, Nadine Mishlawi, who we had so much content. But then the second one, I said, "What would you do with this?" So I was trying to alternate thing between kind of feeling yourself as the object, feeling yourself as like these objects, that do hold some past of people's experiences in them, and that people responded really well to that. It took them a minute, but then they loosened up a lot when they were being that. And one of the things that I was really interested in was how do these objects exist in a contemporary way, and not in the sense of relating them to contemporary objects like that, but to being in front of them as you are today, as some random woman walked down on the steps of the museum and said, "Hey, come inside for a minute," and it's difficult to tell, but there are lots of different accents and lots of different ways in which people spoke, which was really interesting to me because, the museum is not for Lebanese people. I mean, they bring school children there a lot on trips, but generally people were even upset with us, actually, that the audio guide was only in Arabic. Even though it's not super complicated language and it's, very day-to-day language, but there was a kind of feeling, well, are you not being serious by not making this in French? That kind of thing. And I think it was really, that was an interesting, those small dynamics of that power structure, who has the right to speak and what language has the right to speak in a country like that, where French really kind of is the main language, and English now. The other thing with Lebanon that's really interesting is it's got so many different religions and factions and also ways of speaking, because now people speak this kind of 3-language thing, and it was really difficult to stay on Arabic. And I was very willful about it because I wanted it to be by the people for the people, and I wanted to be participating in it, and I wanted it to be hard for me, because I wanted it to be something that I had to put myself back into being the person that I was when I lived in Beirut, and when I never went to the museum, because that museum was the green line. That museum was where the line between East and West Beirut, it's where most of the fighting happened. So much the fighting happened. So you couldn't really, it was, so when you say Madhaf in Arabic, in Lebanon, it relates to everybody as, that's where the fighting's happening, So I think that, and it was bombed out, it was restored in the 1990s. So yeah, there was that, there's the fact that, I think this a lot about museums, like who really does have the voice in the museum, who really has the power. And I think it's a number of different people, including the viewers, how they choose to view things, what they get from it. And so I was trying to work on that. I was trying to say, we're here, this is what we're doing, this is our layer in this museum of things that have been viewed and made, over the centuries, so.
Yeah, it's interesting to think too about the relationship between how much, people, like you sort of said in some ways that the museum is not, people don't feel like it's primarily actually for Lebanese people.
Yeah.
And their relationship with the building is maybe, for a lot of people, I imagine, really hard. You can't sort of extricate it from knowing that was sort of the center of the fighting and the bombing when it was going on. And maybe too, one reason, I don't know that there was anything in the clip we showed that was really specific that people might have recognized, but I know we talked to them about how many people sort of did relate their comments in some ways to either the current political situation in Lebanon or the recent history. And it's interesting to think that just sort of by being in that environment, people might not have been able to kind of, it's not this sort of external outside, like isolated space.
Yeah.
It's this sort of very much tied to all of those.
I had a pretty, the thing is, I mean, we look at Lebanon now because they've had this explosion, this massive explosion at the port in Beirut. But in 2018, there was a lot of possibility. There was a feeling that there was a lot of activism. A lot of the people we brought in from NGOs, voting rights people, we tried to kind of dig deep into the civil society and people who work ambulances and people, all kinds of different people. But the other, the thing that, I had a moment once the audio guide was made. I took some people on tours, and I took this group of older women who had lived through the first war in the 70s, and which is my childhood. And she started to cry because as she listened to the whole thing, she said, "I'm listening to all these young kids, and they can't stop talking about the war." I mean, you don't get that in those first two pieces as much, but there's just so many references to despair and to difficulty. And also there's this one scene, like with the keys, there are these 3 old keys. And I said, if you could do something with these keys, what would you do? This is 2018, 2017, 2018. And everybody was like, we'd lock up the politicians, or we'd open up all the spaces that we're not allowed to go to, that the people are not allowed to. And it was 150 people, and I swear to you, almost every single person answered that way. People didn't talk about trying to get money or taking things or whatever. Almost all of them talked about political things, and these, even children. And that was, so she was crying because she was saying, I can't believe this far gone, and even our kids can't get, the war out of their sense of imagination. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but there was a lot of playfulness too. I think that it was some people left and said they felt like they'd had therapy, because there really was something. And it was also really interesting because I took them in groups of 5, and many didn't know each other. So they were in a group of 5 people that they had no connection to, which was really interesting actually, because then they had to kind of play off each other.
Yeah, that in and of itself is an interesting power dynamic sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
Although what people will say with strangers might actually be more honest than what they would say with people they
absolutely
knew.
Yeah.
And this, I don't know, I thought this piece would be a good transition to a few of the other works, just because it does. And when you were talking about you're like any other, you talked some about your interest in, we were talking about your interest in this sort of individual versus collective experience. And I think that it seems like that drives so much of your interest in participatory work, which is something you've done. So it seems like Chow Hayden, the structure of that, of sort of going out and soliciting input or answers to a question, also relates to another recent work that I was hoping we could talk about, just when in the course of human events. And I'm actually going to screen share again and show a few images of that, of this piece and a couple others. We'll be patient with my Zoom situation. So this is an image of when in the course of human events. Can you sort of talk a little bit about the process of making this?
Yeah. So and this is why I think it's I'm really happy with these two videos are together, because Chow Hayden was 2018. I worked on it 2017, 2018, and then I did this, and then I did A Year Like Any Other. And this really, I was thinking in 2019, there were so many protests everywhere in the streets in Chile and Lebanon, and all of a sudden the street became this place where across the world, where there was a sense, oh, we together can go down and change something which needs to be changed. And so I started thinking about, when in the course of human events is the first line from the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the structure of it is particular in the Declaration of Independence, but I just kind of like the beginning of it as, the beginning of the line. And so what I did was I asked people to continue the sentence. I asked activists, artists from the gallery, artists that I knew, friends, and also like I picked things up myself, and then I did some of it myself as well, like kind of. And so it's like I said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to, and then people continued it. So, it begins with when in the to take a step back, to take a deep breath, to hold out your hands, to hold back your fears, to scream in the night, to, and then it gets deeper, the piece is I don't even know. I mean, there's a sound piece made from it. So I read it, and that's 24 minutes long. So that would give you a kind of feeling for how long the text is. And I transcribed it. So the paper is this microfiber paper that I've been using and that I'm using now. It's very pliable, and I pour ink on it because I like the way that the wetness dries into a kind of almost like a wall or a street or a stone. First it's very, very rich when it's wet, and then it kind of becomes a little chalky. So I poured black ink on this and cut lines, and then wrote it out with whiteout and white ink. And so you can see the way the ink, the black ink kind of marks the paper. And this is a 2-layer piece. So you can see there's a long black scroll, and then these lines are cut on the paper that's above it. And I was interested in the fact that it's kind of not stagnant, like it's like these lines are hanging there, and they're movable, and they move through time, and they're almost I was trying to kind of relate the movement of the street and the sounds of the street, because it felt very exciting at that moment. It felt like there was a lot of possibility. The show opened in December, I think, of 2019, and closed at the end of January, just as people were. In fact, I think it might have been, no, it wasn't. It was almost the last show at the gallery, and everybody was talking at the, about what is this virus thing and whatever, and the ideas of in late January. So it's kind of really interesting because it seemed inconceivable. I remember talking to a lot of people with, how will we ever go back? People are in the streets in Lebanon. We're finally changing something. People are holding hands together. They made a massive human chain across the country. The thought that within a few months, nobody was in the street is kind of,
Yeah, and that it I guess in the context of Lebanon, it felt like this sort of hard stop, like there was this momentum and something happening, and then the virus kind of really ended
So
that.
the in and out aspect, like what, which the idea, this piece was kind of not a manifesto, but a kind of sense of, okay, we stand here right now. When at this point, what can we do? And so that was, that's.
I was sort of curious with, I guess, the choice, the using that text from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, if that was something, when you asked people, it's a weird tension of, I never want to assume that people from other countries sort of, that they would know that, but then it's also sort of a weird myopia as an American to sort of not realize how much people sort of know about the country because they sort of have to in a way. So I was curious, like, if people were familiar with the phrase, if they sort of knew where it was from when you.
I did frame it. I did, when I wrote to people, when I talked to people, I explained kind of what I was trying to do. And I think using, even if people don't know it, the concept of, like, the phrase, forgetting that we think of the Declaration of Independence as something, just the words Declaration of Independence, to people who've been oppressed, which is most people, most of the places that people were actually, actively doing this, they were declaring something, freedom, independence, that kind of thing. So I think they got it. I mean, I never had, people. I was also saying, at this specific point, and I said, and I always say this with a lot of the projects, you can answer it from a very personal place, or you can answer it from the sense of, politically or socially what you feel is happening. So there's a lot of stuff in it that's really personal. Somebody says to eat a pineapple, and I really like that. Again, like A Year Like Any Other, I like that juxtaposition between the personal and the political,
Yeah, and then you mentioned too the text from this work became Declaration, the audio piece, and that's a recording of you speaking the words.
Yeah, it's a recording of me reading the whole thing, and then I collaborated with a sound artist, Miriam Schickler, and we collected sounds of people. In fact, it began because a friend of mine who I collaborate with in Lebanon, Rania Jabber, was sending me. She was sending me sound every day when she was going out in the protests, and so the sound is in there. So I read the whole thing, and it kind of runs through sounds of the street, sounds of my life, walking up the steps at ISCP, like making the work. And so I recorded a lot of that, and it feels, I think, when you listen to the sound piece, it kind of meanders. It feels like never ending. Because it goes on and on and on, and I changed the tense. So in this, it says to think, to walk, to, there it says in the Declaration piece, I speak it in the first person. So I take a step back, I take a deep breath, I hold out my hands, I hold back my tears, I scream in the night, so it's kind of becoming that's where it shifts. Taking possession of all of these things.
Yeah, and that gets back to your, I guess, sort of something in your practice that seems to come up again and again, or a strategy you use often in terms of inviting people to participate in some way or to contribute. And when we spoke last week, we talked a lot about how you navigate the power dynamics of that as an artist, and sort of what it means to take on, and I mean, in this case, sort of take on people's, use your own voice to sort of take on other people's words, or in other work where you're sort of asking someone to do something, and what did they get in exchange? I don't know, is that it also, I think for you, you're interested in that tension, if I'm correct, or sort of the dynamics of that. Is that something you've that's felt like important to you as an artist to think about kind of what those relationships are like?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I don't have a straight up answer to it. I actually enjoyed our conversation. I thought a lot about it afterwards. We talked about solidarity, and I think for me, just really personally, I feel like we do have a responsibility to how we live together.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, I feel like I'm a pretty political person. I think that, and I think how do we, art, how does art reflect solidarity, in a way that's really personal? Because to me, there's also the fact that, I like to read poetry. I like words. I like, I'm not trying, I don't want my work to be something that's trying to tell you anything that you have to feel. I just want you to interact with it and feel your own presence. That's really what it's about for me. It's like, I'm there when I'm making it. You can see my hand, you can see, my mistakes, my trying to put things together, trying to hold them together, and the repetitious work of like just transcribing something.
Mm-hmm.
But I want that, my hope is that that's what happens to you when you're there, that you're reading it, that you're feeling something, that you're putting yourself in that place, that it becomes about you too. And so that's the first level of the dynamic that I'm interested in, and I hope that there's an equivalence to it. I really do, and it's very difficult though, because it's my work,
mm-hmm.
and my name is on there. So whenever I do ask people, I always hope to ask them something which just the question gives them something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm asking people, what do you forgive yourself for? And when I first started it, I thought, people may not, how will people respond to that? I've gotten unbelievable responses, and very, very many of them, take a long time to respond to me and then actually thank me for it. And I don't mean that in a way of trying to be, whatever. It's just that I know that sometimes a question can be a gift, and I'm not trying to give a gift, but I just want to make sure that I'm giving you something if you're giving me something. I want there to be some kind of sense that there isn't a hierarchy here. Yeah, so I don't know if that totally answers it. The power dynamic, for me, I think we all know we live in a system that's so oppressive for so many people, and where so many people don't have a voice, and so I feel like if we're all together and we do this and we put our voices together, it doesn't matter who did it, it just matters that we're there together.
Mm-hmm.
So I try, it's never a straight line, and there are always kinds of things to put into question, but yeah, I try to be in solidarity with people in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And by solidarity, I mean being with someone as they go through life, which itself is a struggle, and they have different, struggles, and they're not like me necessarily, and sometimes they are, solidarity doesn't have to be having the same experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's in some ways the challenge, the reason it can be a challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
But also the reason it's so important. Yeah. You mentioned the current project where you've been asking people what they forgive themselves
for. Yeah.
Or let's see, that's another image. And is that one of the works in the upcoming show? I know there's a couple pieces.
Yeah, I'm actually this work is for an upcoming show in Dallas called Gods and Grifters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a series of works that are on this microfiber paper where I'm cutting out the language, and then it's suspended off the wall. And I was kind of looking at ancient Babylonian, Mesopotamian, etched lists of things, which I just love the way the language is kind of cut into these stones and very repetitive visually. So that's what this is, what this work and the next work that you'll show. But the Forgiveness Project is going to be in Munich in an exhibition, and it's going to be a sound piece. And so people are sending me what they forgive themselves for, and I'm going to voice it myself. So it'll be in the first person. So I forgive myself for not seeing the warning signs. I forgive myself for divorcing my first husband. This is like I'm just some of the things that people, and it's totally anonymous. And whoever's on here, if you would like to forgive yourself for something and have me voice it, you can just write to me at iforgivemyself@gmail.com. Because I'm still collecting them, but that's not for this show. That's for Munich.
Okay.
This is where the title "Gods and Grifters" comes from. It's lists of things that we have been or could be. As a kind of with these new pieces, I'm kind of thinking about solidity, so the solid and the insolid, because these are very, very light. This paper is very malleable, and it just hangs by 2 pins. But this is pretty large. It's 80 by 60, and so I'm thinking about language kind of hanging there as a residue, but it's not stone, it's paper.
Right, which is sort of the opposite in some sense of its fragility, although I know there's a Emily Fussner, and one of the AEC's resident artists, works a lot with paper and talks a lot about how it's actually stronger than people think it is, that it has
totally. Yeah.
It's this weird sort of dichotomy or tension of it being fragile in some ways and strong in others.
That's exactly, I think it's really that's exactly, I only use paper, different kinds of paper, but I really always, maybe it's because, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm afraid of kind of making stuff that takes up space. I don't know, maybe it's my childhood of running away all the time and stuff like that, but I really like the idea that you can make something really, really big and expansive, but its materiality feels ephemeral or feels like it's about to disappear. But yeah, paper lasts a long, long time.
I'm going to stop sharing and wanted to sort of check in with the audience. If anyone does have questions for Annabel, I'd be happy to take a few audience questions as well. You can put them in the Q&A. And that, I don't know, the fragility of paper, which I know we've seen a couple pieces today. It's a material you work with fairly often.
Yeah.
Sort of cut paper and I'm struck by the relationship between that and language, your other interest, and it being something you can manipulate and move around. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know. I think maybe it relates to pages, words on paper. I also, my parents had a bookstore in Beirut before the war, and when the war happened, our bomb shelter was the book storage, and I spent a lot of, there was also not a lot to do, so I read a lot. So I do think also language is a really important part of Arabic, of Arabic culture, and for me, at least more so than visual things, I always saw language as something that I don't know, created what I saw, that's how I could see it, so and it's only gotten, I used to be a painter at one point, and it's only gotten more and more, I've only gotten more and more into language, actually. So.
Well, we have a few audience questions. Let's see, one of them's a little bit long, so I just want to make sure I get it right. So someone asks, the work titled When in the Course of Human Events, and the decision to borrow that line from the Declaration of Independence also seems to connect to a larger body of work you've created that engages with founding documents of US nationhood, like the one you transcribed into Arabic, or that deals simply with America writ large, literally. Can you talk more about the connection to those previous works?
Yeah, I think, for me, growing up in Lebanon, I always thought of America as this place that would, save me, I guess. When I got here, a lot of this work started after 9/11. What I did was when we went into war in Iraq, I threw away all my paints and stopped being a painter in 2003, March of 2003. And I didn't know what else to do. So I put up a piece of paper and I transcribed the US Constitution phonetically in Arabic. And part of the reason I did that was I was thinking, America keeps saying how we're, like Arabic's so bad and it's so scary and these terrorists and all of that kind of stuff. And I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting if there's this Arabic text and it's actually just this, piece of America, like this Constitution that they keep lording over our heads as like, and it, yeah, I think there was a kind of rebellious aspect to it when I began, and then I got really interested in what is this place that seems to promise something to so many people who are in difficult situations, and it seems like this kind of it seems like it's trying to say that it's the solution. Mm-hmm. And I think conceptually there is something to that, living together, but it doesn't work. And so, I think, I don't think I'm trying to be didactic or anything. I think I'm just trying to say, yeah, well, this is, this is the imagination. I mean, America is the imagination of a better thing, which we don't have.
Right. Well, and so much the promise of that is kind of in those texts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even like from the beginning, right? Like even at the point of, all men are created equal, even at the point where the country was still had, it had a system of slavery, which is, just sort of, the words have always sort of promised this higher thing that wasn't.
In the Declaration of Independence, the original one that he wrote actually had stuff about, it's not the one that we actually have is not what he first wrote, and he did write about slavery, but it was kind of taken out. There's all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think in a bigger picture, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms about America, like we all do. I mean, I have a lot, but I also think that there is something, everything can be criticized. Every country can be criticized. I mean, I come from, people do manage to live together here to some extent, and that is an interesting, human experiment. So what can we do with that, actually?
There's a couple more questions. Someone asks, when did interacting with the public become core to your art?
I did a piece in 2010. I represented the US in the Cairo Biennial, and I hadn't been to Lebanon in a long time, and they gave me a chunk of money because it was through the US State Department. So I went back and forth between New York and Beirut, and along the way I asked people, where are you coming from? Because when I got to America, people used to just look at me, and it's different now, but they would say, where are you from? Where are you from? And so I thought that I would ask people where they're coming from, and they, in English and in Arabic, and they would say, I'm coming from my grandmother's house. I really meant, where are you coming from right now? And it was kind of taking the rip. And so it became a sound piece and a paper piece. Like the paper piece was, I asked myself, where are you now? And my only answer was, I'm here. And then there was a sound piece accompanying it with people responding in English and Arabic as to where they were coming from, where they were going. And it was really scary stopping random strangers in the street the first few times I did it. And then all of a sudden it became incredibly fun. Mm-hmm. And because, people are scared, so yeah, I don't know, that was the beginning. And then I kind of thought, oh, this is good. And people enjoyed it. That was the thing, talking about, people would enjoy responding. They'd get kind of into it, and then I'd walk away and they'd call me back. And so it was that kind of, 2010, I guess.
Yeah. yeah, that's always something that I admire artists who work with the public in that way, because I think just personality wise, that is not something that I think I would. Have you found, like, in having done projects in different places, like how universal is the sort of response, or does it sort of, change it all, based on where you are and when?
People are really kind of bizarrely similar and very moving all the time. I mean, I have to say, like, the more I do things like this, I mean, I had this fortune project where I wrote people's fortunes, but I've done that across the world, like literally in so many different countries and contexts. It's always incredible. It's always incredible how small things can move you and other people, like really small exchanges. I don't think my exchanges with people are important or even trying to be too meaningful, but sometimes just answering a small question to a stranger, or just being for a second with somebody that you didn't expect to be with, can actually be something really meaningful, and it builds. I mean, I think when we live with each other in ways that kind of, where we acknowledge the other person's being there, whether it's not about agreement, it's not about exchanging whatever, it's just about, just being conscious of being with somebody else for a minute. Yeah.
Well, there's one final question, and this is from Bridget. How did you begin to work with words and language? Or did you always work with language? And would you consider that your primary medium?
Yeah, I used to make paintings, and then I'd embed some line of poetry in it somewhere. Lots of Emily Dickinson, but it would just, or I'd title the work a line of poetry. And then really, I think it really was the Constitution. When I threw away my paints because of George Oppen, the poet, who I'm really into this poem by him called "Of Being Numerous." And I read something about how he stopped writing poetry for 20 years during World War II, I guess. And so when we went into Iraq in March of 2003, I was like, well, who can be an artist anymore? Like, what's the point of this? And there's no language. I mean, we had George Bush as president, which was, the language at that period of time was so repulsive and meaningless and empty that I think that's, I think that's when everything shifted for me. I got rid of my paints, and then I was left with this piece of paper, and and there's Greta Byron, my former or current collaborator on many language-based things, and Of Being Numerous is an incredible poem that everybody should read.
And can you say the poet's name again?
George Oppen, Oppen.
Well, thank you so much, Annabel. This was really great, and it was great to hear actually that I was hoping we would talk about other recent work, and I wasn't sure how far back we'd be able to get. So it's really interesting to hear about your transition from painting to, almost seems like sort of almost cutting out the middle medium.
Yeah,
you've been working with language before, and then you went sort of.
It is. I mean, I think it is my main medium, actually. So yeah. And Blair, I really appreciate, honestly, it's a gift when you get to see your work. I mean, get to see your work seen in a different kind of way, and the way you link the two videos, I was really, a lot to me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for the conversation today. It's been really great. Thanks to everyone who is here watching. We were recording, so we'll have this up on our YouTube page and our website hopefully soon. We're in the process of getting a few things up from recent virtual events. And like I mentioned, Annabel's work is on view at Arlington Arts Center through this Saturday. So if you're in the area, please come by and see the show. And then her work will be on view in Dallas starting April 9th, if you happen to be in the Dallas area. And but thanks everyone for being here, and I hope you all have a Good day, and thanks again, Annabelle.
Thank you.